dive into an analysis on how investments tied to nuclear weapons industry could expose financial institutions, asset managers, and investors to long-term instability, regulatory pressure, and reputational harm, and ask questions about how the world's most destructive weapons intersect with global finance and what responsible investments mean in the renewed nuclear age. To give us some context and enlighten us a bit, we'll start with an introduction by Dr. Luke Kemp. Kemp is a best-selling author and research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and his latest book, Goliath's Curse: The History and Future of Societal Collapse, has received great reviews and has been covered by media outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian. I could go on saying more about Luke, but I'll just leave the floor to him, so please give him a hand.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So today I want to speak to you about nuclear war and its impacts both on the global economy, casualties, human population, and also what this means for our finances. Imagine an 800 kiloton nuclear weapon, which is a pretty average sized nuclear weapon like a Topol missile in the Russian arsenal right now, dropped in the middle of New York City. Within 24 hours, 1.5 million people would be dead. Within a month, roughly another 1.5 million would be dead due to radiation sickness and other injuries. Within a 5-kilometer radius, people would be almost instantaneously vaporized. Within a 12-kilometer radius, essentially everyone would die, and most concrete buildings would reduce to rubble. Within 18 kilometers, essentially most people have 3rd-degree burns and will eventually get radiation sickness and die. It's worthwhile bearing in mind the reality of what we're talking about when we talk about nuclear weapons. If the same weapon was dropped in the middle of Oslo, roughly 300,000 people, a third of a million, would die. Roughly a third of a million would be injured and probably die after the space of a month or two. Yet it could potentially be much, much worse. That's one missile. But currently, nuclear arsenals across the world contain roughly 10,000. That's luckily a decrease from a high of roughly 70,000 in 1988 and 1987. But nuclear arsenals around the world are once again growing, with both China, the UK, and others having signaled that they are looking to increase their stockpiles of nuclear warheads. And of course, beyond that, we have improvements in delivery of nuclear weapons. Things like hypersonic missiles, for instance, or the autonomous nuclear-powered submarine Poseidon, recently pioneered by Russia. What would happen if we actually have a use of most of these weapons? Say, for instance, a thermonuclear war between the US and Russia. Just how bad could it get, in other words? One thing to bear in mind here is that when you have a nuclear strike upon a city, essentially what happens is the city becomes a smokestack. It starts to pile up huge amounts of soot into the atmosphere. What that soot and smoke does is essentially creates nuclear winter-like conditions across the world, blocking out sunlight and, of course, reducing crop yields. So just how bad could it get? At least one study suggests that it could result in the death of roughly 5 billion people due to decreases in crop yields globally. Now, in some ways, this is quite a pessimistic calculation. This is over half of the world's population, of course. The model does have some very pessimistic assumptions, for instance, that there's no trade between countries. But I'd argue that if anything, it's actually maybe an overly rosy and optimistic picture of just how bad nuclear war could get. That's because there's several effects that we don't usually include when it comes to nuclear winter modeling. One of these is fried electrical infrastructure. Things like electricity transformers would be essentially rendered useless due to the electromagnetic pulse released by a nuclear weapon. Essentially an expanding sphere of electromagnetism which tends to destroy electrical infrastructure. These can be quite powerful. If you have one released in the middle of the contiguous United States over a kilometer high in the air, that could potentially wipe out most electrical infrastructure across the US. And it's worthwhile bearing in mind that these highly customized Electrical transformers usually take roughly 2 years to manufacture. If you also have the global economy trying to recover from a nuclear war, it's unclear how long it would take to get the electricity grid back online. It may also take a very long time to get the internet back online. The internet works by something called Border Gateway Protocol. In short, every computer relies upon being able to route through multiple other ones. If enough computers and servers are down, then potentially the entire internet goes down with it, and it might be very difficult to get back online. Importantly, the soot in the atmosphere also degrades ozone. You're not supposed to go outside when ozone is usually above the level of 11. In the wake of a large-scale nuclear war, UV levels could exceed 35 to 45, which means much, much higher rates of skin cancer. And the world in many ways would become a global petri dish. You'd have huge numbers of people in the hundreds of millions, potentially billions, with compromised immune systems moving around. That is a hotbed of zoonotic infections. And of course, there's many other things here. Bear in mind that 9/11 involved the loss of 3,000 people, and yet it led to both the largest mass surveillance program ever enacted in history in the US, and additionally roughly $3 to $5 trillion worth of wars. Imagine what could happen if you have instead an entire thermonuclear war between the US and Russia. So those are some reasons to think that it actually could be much worse than just 5 billion people. Now, what's the likelihood of actually having a nuclear war? Because one could say, yes, that's a horrible, catastrophic scenario, but it's so low probability, we don't need to worry about it. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. Most models and expert predictions, while highly uncertain, usually converge around the probability of nuclear war every year being somewhere between 0.01 to 7%. That's based off a number of different studies I compiled together. The most recent large-scale study using super forecasters, who are essentially the most accurate way of doing forecasts and tend to win all the intelligence agencies' forecasting tournaments. So 80 super forecasters gave a probability of 1.5% of a nuclear war by the middle of the century and 4% by the end of the century. These aren't exactly low probability numbers. And importantly, the numbers tend to go up during periods of geopolitical turmoil and strife. How long would it take for an economy to recover from a large-scale nuclear war? The initial studies throughout the 60s and 70s, particularly in the US, tended to downplay the impacts and suggest that this would only take a couple of years to recover from. There's a very famous quote from the Undersecretary of Defense in 1987 who said, "If there are enough shuttles to go around, everybody is going to make it." So a very blasé and casual attitude about how bad this could be. Unfortunately, once the studies started to happen in research organizations rather than coming from military organizations, the numbers looked quite different. So in 1987, the MIT released a study casually known as the nuclear crash, where they spoke about how even a small-scale nuclear war between the US and Russia could lead to a situation in which it would take decades to recover the economy in the US, or potentially maybe even irrecoverable. Most recently this year, the Nuclear Threat Initiative published a paper talking about how we lack evidence right now to think through how bad the impacts could be on the global economy. Bear in mind, since the 1950s, global trade has increased, I think, roughly 4,400%, or something along those lines. We live in a very different world of globalized digital trade. The world is much more interdependent and highly interconnected. And we haven't really had many studies since then to think through what are the economic impacts. But in some ways, if we're thinking about the loss of 5 billion people or more, it's potentially redundant. It's like asking what is your income after being hit by a truck. What we're talking about when we start to look at nuclear war is what, in my field, we call existential risk. Historically, we've had some events throughout global history where approximately 10% of global population has been lost, such as the invasion of the Americas. We haven't really had more than that. We usually talk about a global catastrophe as being a loss of more than 10%. That's the same kind of threshold the super forecasts we're using as well. And when you start to think about global societal collapse or human extinction, that's when we start to talk about existential risk. And these existential risks have very big implications for institutional investors. Something we explored recently in a paper published last year called Financing Our Final Hour. Institutional investors are very large investors who essentially invest money on the behalf and benefit of others. And they tend to have very broad stakes across the entire global economy. And of course, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund fits this profile perfectly. It owns approximately 1.5% of global equities and is $2 trillion approximately in size. There's numerous different reasons as to why institutional investors should be thinking much more closely about existential risks like nuclear war. One is simple ethical obligations. The ethics of who you invest in, of course, have become much more at the forefront of global discussions when it comes to climate change, but most of the same arguments used in climate change also apply to nuclear weapons. The very basic ones, like for instance, there's a violation of humanitarian principles if any single nuclear weapon is used. And that profiting from harm is simply the wrong thing to do. And that, of course, there's no pensions in a nuclear-ravaged world. The similar argument is being made to climate change, that there's no degrees in a dead planet. And there are certain areas of business ethics which suggest that most companies, including institutional investors, whether it be universities or pension funds, have a duty to protect their stakeholders, even from lower probability but very high consequence risks like nuclear war. Now, the typical response here is, sure, that may be true, but we have an obligation to maximize profits. That is usually based upon a series of rulings in the United States, which have become collectively known as the business judgment rule. And there's been similar rulings in at least 5 other countries across Europe, so Germany, Croatia, Poland, Romania, and the last one is Italy, I believe. But it's unclear how widely this actually applies. And importantly, it's actually highly contested amongst scholars. Many, like Lynn Stout, contend that there actually is no single fiduciary duty to maximize returns. Instead, this is actually something which was mainly pioneered by Milton Friedman in 1970 with the idea of the Friedman Doctrine. But it's more of an ideological concept rather than a very clear legal one. In short, whether we have to maximize profits is naturally dependent, and it's actually much more complicated than people tend to expect. It's important to remember that when it comes to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, it's also supposed to exist in perpetuity. Its very mission says to safeguard and build financial wealth for future generations. And there are many such institutions. Universities, pension funds, many large-scale institutional investors are supposed to not just exist in 10 years' time or 100, but in perpetuity, which means suddenly low probability risks, which stack up over the space of decades and centuries, become much more relevant to your underlying mission. So does ethical investment even hurt returns in the first place? It's one thing to say that the business judgment rule is complicated, but that relies upon the assumption that divesting away from things like nuclear weapons or fossil fuels is going to harm your bottom line. In short, the answer is, as far as we know, no. There's been a huge number of different studies looking at ESG, fossil-free portfolios, etc. And in general, most of the studies come to the conclusion of maybe there's a little bit of impact. Potentially ESG portfolios actually offer higher returns. The only really strong finding across all studies is that they tend to have, this is divested ESG portfolios, tend to have less volatility. The most recent meta-review suggests that they actually have higher returns as well. This is a meta-review published this year. But in general, the literature is kind of all over the place. You can ask your local large language model, and it'll give you a pretty similar answer as well. That we don't really know. There's studies on both sides. But at the very least, there's no strong evidence that divesting from fossil fuels or from nuclear weapons will harm your underlying returns. And importantly, there may be some benefits in the longer term when it comes to avoiding regulatory and even reputational risk. So currently today, roughly $500 billion is spent on nuclear weapons through bonds and shares. And approximately $276 billion is spent in financing at least 24 companies who are involved in the upgrading and maintenance of nuclear weapons. And it's important to remember that many of these weapons, technically speaking, should be unusable. When it comes to fossil fuels, we speak of the idea of unburnable carbon, that essentially the vast majority of carbon that we have access to, we can't burn if we want to stay within 2 degrees Celsius. All of those become stranded assets. It's important to remember that most of the nuclear arsenals are technically speaking, or should be, stranded assets. Bear in mind that even a regional war between India and Pakistan could drop global temperatures by roughly 3 to 5 degrees Celsius over the space of 5 years, once again leading to the death of potentially hundreds of millions or more people. India and Pakistan only have roughly 170 weapons each, meaning they only account for roughly 3.5% of the global stockpile. So one could very easily say, if you can just take that as a rough threshold, that over 97% of the global stockpile of nuclear weapons are unusable. And then there's more theoretical ideas like universal ownership theory, which is becoming increasingly prominent amongst finance scholars. It's essentially the idea that if you are a very large institutional investor who holds stakes across the entire global economy, you have an interest in making sure the economy does not crash in the long term. Pretty basic. And importantly, you can't diversify away from global risks. You can't diversify away from the impacts of a global thermonuclear war. And hence, institutional investors like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, if anything, should be trying to internalize the externalities. And that, of course, is exactly what a nuclear war is. It's an externalized cost which isn't included right now in portfolios, but should be reflected in them. So to summarize, there's numerous different considerations as to why we should be thinking about the worst case scenarios and about catastrophic risk when it comes to our investment portfolios, particularly for large scale institutional investors. These include ethical obligations, legal considerations, perpetuation of the institution, etc. And there's another thing we didn't talk about, which I think is really important, particularly in the context of Norway: democracy. Earlier this year in May, there was a citizens' assembly run on what should be the kind of underlying principles that guide the Sovereign Wealth Fund going forward. And there's two which really stick out, which are quite relevant to nuclear weapons. One is that, first of all, citizen assemblies should be used more often. And I'd put forward that if we're going to take this question seriously, we should have a citizens' assembly on, essentially, should the Sovereign Wealth Fund be investing in nuclear weapons? And second is that at least close to a supermajority of people want to see a situation in which the oil fund actually reduces its need to have returns in order to have more socially beneficial impacts. At the end of the paper, we put forward two key ideas of what all of this means for large-scale institutional investors like the Sovereign Wealth Fund. The first is that if you take all of these things seriously, the perpetuation of the institute, returns, ethical obligations, it should lead you to the idea of what we call a financial Hippocratic oath. First, do no harm. In other words, do not directly invest in any kind of catastrophic risk, whether that be fossil fuels or nuclear weapons. But one could make an argument that we should go further than that. If you're supposed to be safeguarding and building wealth for future generations, you shouldn't just be doing the bare minimum of avoiding global catastrophe. Instead, you should be doing what we call the financial oath of Maimonides, which is much less known, but is an oath taken by pharmacists, in which they agree not just to first do no harm, but to essentially protect all of God's creatures. And a financial oath of Maimonides would be very similar, that in order to safeguard and protect wealth for future generations, we have to actively reduce the risk of global catastrophe, including nuclear weapons. I'll leave it at that for now. Hope that provides some food for thought, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Luke. I'll welcome the panel up to the stage and then give them a brief introduction, and we'll get on with our talk. So we have with us today Stian Ueland, who is the portfolio manager of DNB European Defence, investing in public equities across the aerospace and defence industry. He joined DNB Asset Management in 2021 after serving as a portfolio manager at Norwegian Bank Investment Management. Stian holds a master's from London Business School and a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And next to him, we have Karolina Malisauskaite, who is responsible investment analyst at KLP. She is responsible for corporate governance and also focuses on weapons research. She joined KLP in 2022 following her tenure at Institutional Shareholder Services, where she conducted proxy research for the Nordic region. And last but not least, we have my colleague Grethe Lauglo Østern, who is the acting head of policy at Norwegian People's Aid and the editor of the research project Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. And Grethe has previously represented NPA in the international steering group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and has worked in the International Humanitarian Law Unit of the Norwegian Red Cross. So a strong panel with us today. Thank you guys for being here. I think we'll just head off, and I wanted to ask you first, Karolina, representing KLP, who has chosen to exclude investments in nuclear weapons. I even found a news article from as far back as 2006 describing how KLP at that time, following the advice of the oil fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, divested from 7 companies. You have a long history of taking a stance against investing in nuclear weapons. Could you elaborate a bit for us on the reasoning behind this?
Sure. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to be here and represent KLP on a very important and at the same time controversial topic. This is what I hear going around and also debating in different panel debates, that it is very controversial, challenging topic to discuss. But I think it's very important we discuss it, so that we have all the views up there and we can look at them. I would like to actually take 2 steps back because there is a common misconception that if we are not investing in nuclear weapons, we are not investing in weapons at all. So just to clarify, KLP is not against defense industry. Our index has a 2.5% weight in defense industry or weapons companies. And despite the fact that we are not investing in nuclear weapons, our exposure is quite close to what index says. And coming back to 2006, one of the first exclusions, it's not a secret that among institutional investors in Norway, we definitely follow close the guidelines from the state fund, the governmental pension fund. This is a standard. This is a minimum standard. So naturally, once they came out with their recommendation, when the Ethical Council came with the recommendation, and then following that, the fund has excluded those companies, we also looked into them and did our own assessment. And what is the reasoning behind that? And it has stayed consistent for the past 20 years, so up to now, is that at the end of the day, we as investors, we have to respect the humanitarian principles, the basis, the fundamentals. And nuclear weapons is a very specific type of weapon. It's because its scope of impact, if they are ever used, it's enormous. Luke has gone through that, and I'm really happy he raised the points that we usually don't take up in discussions, like how we are not having electricity, internet. How do you imagine the world without that? So that's the thing. If nuclear weapons are being used, this is absolutely incompatible with the humanitarian law. And then we are in a breach with our guidelines. So that is basically the reasoning. That was one exclusion. We also did another big exclusion back in 2021, where we reviewed again our exposure to nuclear weapons and excluded 14 companies. I guess that's briefly it, but before I give you back the word, Teresa, I think I would like to highlight a few things. That last exclusion that we did, right, 14 companies sounds a lot. This is what attracts media attention. We assessed 75 companies. They, according to our data providers, to the tips we had, could have one or the other relationship to nuclear weapons and to other types of controversial weapons as well. However, it is not that we exclude by default any company which has any tie, so we have certain limitations around it. And it's a comprehensive assessment on a, I would say, a case-by-case basis. What is the product, how the company, where the company contributes, how large is that contribution, and what nature of it is there. So, and those assessments are never easy because, of course, a company which is involved in nuclear weapons is not stating that very clearly on their website. It's not uncommon in general in defense industry to have code names for the projects that far away sounds from something similar to weapons. A recent example from another topic is how Israel calls their war is Iron Swords War. If you check it, if you don't know the context, then I don't think you're going to realize that we're talking about the war happening in Gaza. So it's sort of a hard research in terms that there is little information. Companies are not open about that. They would barely ever confirm anything because they would lean on that they have non-disclosure agreements and they cannot comment on it. And there is even no common definitions of what's a nuclear weapon, what's a controversial weapon, which concrete weapons could be included there. So it's a lot of things we have to go through, and we do, to the best extent possible, comprehensive assessments against the guidelines we have. So I guess shortly, not shortly, from me.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I'll jump directly to you, Stian. In May of this year, DNB launched the DNB European Defence Equity Fund as a new savings options for your customers. 3 of the companies included in this fund's portfolio are on KLP's exclusion list due to their involvement in nuclear weapons production. And as the fund's manager, I wanted to ask you, how do you evaluate the risk-return trade-off associated with investing in nuclear weapons? And additionally, if we get to that, if you could explain the rationale for including these companies at a time when many other investors are choosing to exclude them.
Yeah.
Easy question.
So I think if you look at these companies, that's my job, to look at these companies and sort of understand what they do and if they're good investments or not. And if you look at what they do with nuclear weapons, it's usually very small. It's a small part. It's for their financials, it's an all but it's not an important part, right? So if they stop doing that tomorrow, that would probably not affect the equity value, I think. And I also don't think there's a causal link between our investments and the probability of a nuclear war. I think that's driven by states' decisions. And even if the entire capital markets disappear tomorrow, those states would find ways to finance those programs. They don't need the capital markets to do that. And I think for me that sort of reduces the question to an ethical one, meaning, am I comfortable investing in these companies? Am I comfortable benefiting from this activity? Yeah. And when it comes to the fund, you know, I want to say that we also have exclusions for controversial weapons. So we also have an exclusion list. And I also fully understand that people don't want to invest in this fund or maybe in other funds that have certain types of companies in them, including those that you mentioned. And but luckily, the capital markets are quite inventive when they can, you know, smell a profit. So there's plenty of opportunities, plenty of products out there for people that want to invest in a different way. But the companies that we invest in, you know, the overwhelming majority of their activity is to arm European nation states with the aim of deterring a greater war in Europe. And this, I think, is a theme that I can't speak for our clients, but presumably I think it's a good investment theme, and presumably they feel like this is a mission that they can get behind, and therefore the product in its current form.
Thank you. I think we'll get back to some of the points, but I'll first give the word to Grethe. And yeah, as Stian touched upon here, it's the fact that many defense and aerospace companies do have these sort of dual purposes, civil and military, and they work on a multitude of different weapons. Can you tell us a bit about why NPA believes it's important for investors to distinguish between nuclear weapons-related activities from the other more widely accepted business areas within these companies?
Thank you, Teresa. To answer that question, we have to consider that there are different types of rationales, different types of arguments that are being presented from investors as to why it is believed to be right to do it. It's not just one argument. You mentioned a couple. One of the rationales is that it doesn't really matter what you make your profit on. I won't go into that. We believe it does. There are ethical obligations. The second point that some investors and politicians in Norway and other European countries make this clear case that it's almost a duty to invest in companies that produce and maintain nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, it's argued, provide more peace and more security, can prevent a bigger war. And this is stated without batting an eye, really, which is where we try to create more recognition of the fact that there is an overconfidence in nuclear deterrence, despite the fact that nuclear weapons are a source of constant insecurity to all of us, and despite the knowledge that people like Luke here presented to us today about the risks that are involved in continuing to go down this path and giving nuclear weapons a central role in global politics. We have to, as a society, be able to recognize soon that nuclear deterrence is a security logic that will end in the use of nuclear weapons. History shows us, we have Kjell Vegland sitting here, for instance, that done a lot of research on this, how history shows us that it's often luck and chance that determine the outcome of nuclear crisis. And when you recognize that nuclear deterrence means betting on luck, investing on luck, it's clear that it's a deeply problematic security policy, which is becoming increasingly frail, and which will lead to the use of nuclear weapons. And then there are those that argue not that we have to invest in these companies because they produce nuclear weapons and we want to support that, but we have to invest in them because they also make the conventional weapons that we need. A perception has been created, in particular, I think, that the European defense industry is weak because we can't invest in them because of the nuclear weapons criterion. And that we have to start investing in them to strengthen them. But the facts tell a very different story. The companies that are involved in the production of nuclear weapons do not have liquidity problems. On the contrary, they report substantial profits. So that argument doesn't hold up, and that's why we are trying to create awareness around this. Thanks.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And over to you, Luke, hearing what our panelists are reflecting on here. Do you have any comments?
Oh, quite a few. I mean, it's a very deep topic.
Yeah.
First of all, I think Carolina makes a very important point here that there is a difference between investing in defense, investing in the military, versus investing in nuclear weapons. And I'd say similarly, there's also a difference between investing in the military in general versus investing in continental defensive capabilities. There's often technologies which are much more effective for defense or for offense. So I think we have to be much more sophisticated in the way we think about investment if we really are doing this in order to defend Europe, per se. I think there's also some really important points raised around how important is it to potentially avoid investments in nuclear weapons? Is this going to make a difference to the probability of things like nuclear war? I'd say it's an open question. I mean, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that the nuclear modernization program of the US is roughly $1.5 trillion over the space of 3 decades. The numbers I brought up before were roughly, $750 billion overall in terms of finance, bonds, that share holder value, etc. that's quite a lot. So I actually could see investments potentially playing a role in terms of how large nuclear arsenals are and potentially the overall probability of things like nuclear war. And the second one that was raised is this idea of ethics. And it's a very important, interesting question. And it might be worthwhile thinking back to how did the entire idea of divestment come about in the first place? And this takes us back a few decades to apartheid in South Africa. One of the first big campaigns was by Dartmouth students in Swarthmore, who basically said we shouldn't be investing in apartheid South Africa, which seemed kind of crazy at the time, but of course we kind of accept as being just common sense today. But one of the key points there was they didn't say these companies only invest a small amount in racism. That the racism percentage is really quite low when it comes to portfolio. Instead, it really was supposed to be much more of a general, clear, ethical principle with moral clarity of you should not be investing in companies who are supporting South African apartheid. And I think we can draw similar lines here. Indeed, if we can't draw lines and have ethical clarity when it comes to nuclear weapons and nuclear war, I'm not really sure where we can, to be frank. And in terms of deterrence, I mean, this is a wonderful point. I should live it, first of all. And we have a common colleague here, Benoit Pelopoulos, who talks about deterrence, as you mentioned, in terms of luck. I mean, first of all, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that while we often talk about the idea of nuclear deterrence and of there being a great peace caused by nuclear weapons, statistically, you would have to have at least over a century more of peace in order to make that argument in a kind of mathematical fashion. And secondly, as mentioned, luck plays a huge role here. In the last few decades, we've had at least a dozen nuclear misses. And some of these were just sheer dumb luck that we did not end up in thermonuclear war. So who's heard of Stanislav Petrov? Okay, that's pretty good actually, yeah. So essentially, very, very short story. This was an incident during the Cold War in which a Russian-Soviet officer saw a couple of dozen nuclear missiles heading towards Russia, and he faced the decision as to whether to escalate this decision to his superior officer, who very well may have decided to respond with a volley of nuclear weapons back at the US. He luckily reasoned that if the US was going to do a first strike, they'd be sending thousands of weapons rather than a few dozen. And luckily, he was correct. Essentially, what had happened here was there was interference to the satellites, which had caused the computers to malfunction. There were no missiles heading towards Russia at all. He decided not to escalate the decision. But in retrospect, he said it was a 50-50 decision. It was literally the flip of a coin as to whether or not he escalated this to a superior officer. And sure, I think you can have numerous other very interesting and disturbing stories of how this often came down to just really dumb luck, things like stuck hatches, for instance, on submarines that prevented us from having nuclear war. So the deterrence argument doesn't really hold up very well when you look at history.
No, I even have a few examples from Norway where it's been very close to happening. You know, solar reflection or northern lights disturbing, or so luck is definitely a factor. Thank you so much. I think all of you touched a little bit upon the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I mean we planned this event before we knew what was going to happen, which has happened in the last week and a half or so, where there's been, let's say, dramatic developments in terms of the Ethic Council is being on pause and doing a review of the framework of the Ethical Fund. You received kind of a brief update from us in NPA, Luke, but it's been for us in Norway, and I think especially for a panelist, been following the debate probably in the media as well. So I wanted to put the question out there, and I might be looking extra at you, Stian, because you actually worked for the Oil Fund before, as I mentioned in the introduction. And as with KLP, you followed then in 2006 the Oil Fund's recommendation. It's been a global model for ethical investments for over 2 decades now. So I wanted to ask our panel, what do you think? What's really at stake now with the Ethical Council being on pause? The framework is being reviewed. Is this an update to suit the Oil Fund for investing in a more complex world, or is it a step towards weaker ethics? Yes, please, Stian.
Well, I think so. I looked at exclusions for about 10 years, many types of exclusions. You know, oil, gas, genetically modified food, there's many groups that want to exclude different things, and what you find out, or what I find out when I look at it at a company level, is that these issues they really do contain multitudes, right? You very quickly start contradicting yourself. And you mentioned South Africa. It's one country, it's a fairly small country, and that was excluded from many asset managers, but it was also followed up by things like policy, sanctions, these types of things. And at least the work I done, those were the things that probably made a difference. I don't know if the exclusions from equity portfolios made a difference. So, you can argue there's some symbolic effect there. But you had a common stance toward that issue. And for other things, if we go back to nuclear, Norway's buying the frigates from BAE, but we cannot invest in BAE because that's considered unethical, right? You think about France and all the things that people have said about the French nuclear program for 50 years. Easy to criticize it, but now people are saying maybe Charles de Gaulle was right. You cannot trust the Yankees after all. He brought back the gold and he made sure that they could have an independent program. And I wouldn't be surprised if people are asking themselves, could this program be extended to our nation states if we really cannot trust the Americans? So I think what you see is that nuclear weapons being in companies that primarily are in defense, so other weapons that are not so nice either, that was a small corner of the stock market that was kind of left alone a little bit. It seemed straightforward. Now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, maybe it doesn't seem as straightforward. And they're going back and looking at these things because I do think that there has to be some link between what happens in the real world and what happens in equity portfolios. If not, people are going to say that it's just virtue signaling that rings hollow and it doesn't pass a test of common sense. And I don't want to speculate in the outcome of what Norges is going to do. I mean, that's for them to make that decision. But I'm guessing that these things is what they mean by like a changing world. The world is different now. It's time to look at these guidelines again, which I think is also something a responsible investor should do. They should revisit these things from time to time when facts change.
Thank you, Stians. Grethe, I saw you taking down some notes. Did you have any immediate comments? Just for later?
Interesting points, but yeah. First of all, on the difference between buying frigates, buying aircraft, and owning shares in a company. There's a substantial difference in buying something that you need, which is a perfectly legal product that has no ethical considerations around it, from a company that also produces something that you are not buying. So you are stimulating the business that you think that company should be doing more of, rather than nuclear weapons, by buying products from them. And that doesn't mean that you have to also own that company, to own shares in that company. That's not what the ethical, the rules for exclusion and observation and the ethical council is about. It's about ownership. It is not about buying stuff, which is a different part. If Norway, and it seems quite clear that a main ambition here is to open up for investment in companies that produce nuclear weapons, that this seems to be a main driver, just my analysis, of the whole revision of the rules now. If that becomes the end result, that the Norwegian oil fund can start investing in nuclear weapons production, that would mean that Norway would be, apart from the nuclear armed states themselves, the 9 nuclear armed states, one of very, very few countries in the world that do that have state ownership in companies in the nuclear arms industry, and that as a state would profit on that. We looked at this just a year and a half ago, and that the only states that have direct ownership in nuclear weapons production companies, it's apart from the nuclear armed states, it's Belarus, Germany, Italy, and Spain. And why we have to be a part of that and be as the norm, the standard setter that the oil fund is, the trend that would set as well. Why that is so important is very difficult for me to understand.
Yes, Carolina.
I would like to join in a little bit into discussion, and again maybe take a few steps back, because I can echo both what Stian said and what Grethe touched upon. For one thing, to review the guidelines is not a bad thing in itself, because we need to make sure that they actually correspond to its purpose and they serve the purpose they had at the beginning. And we have indeed a very challenging situation globally. It's the most conflicts since the Cold War, 61 active across 36 countries. But so the thing in itself, reviewing the guidelines, is a very useful activity to make sure they still serve the purpose. Another thing we need to remember, is it slippery, slopery? I don't have the answer to that. But indeed, the Oil Fund or the Ethical Council has been a standard setter, and the Oil Fund subsequently. And a lot of, not even Norwegian investors, but global investors have been following closely what they do. So then we have to acknowledge, I mean, they have been doing an incredible work, and I'm sure they will do. Now, back to what Grethe said about buying the product, being a passive buyer, and investing, it has been actually said very clearly in the first guidelines that were written back in 2002, if I'm not mistaken, led by the Hans Peter Graver. And what was written there is that there is quite a difference between owning a company, being a shareholder in the company, and actually owning the shares. Bondholders were actually put into the other category as being the buyers of the product. When you buy the shares, you own part of the company, and you have power. It's strongly said. It's not much we own, right, in each of the company. Even the oil fund owns 1.5%, that's not a lot. But we are the owners of the company, and we have the possibility to impact them, be it through the engagement or through voting our shares, electing, for example, the board. And even though it's minuscule, you could say, in the whole, but it gives us a different type of responsibility. So when we invest in company rather than we buy. So that's, I think it's important to remember that argument as well, and it was in those first guidelines. And then the last thing I would like to note is the guidelines as we see them. Those are, I don't know, 10 sentences, right, covering those guidelines. But those white papers that come, that's a 200, 300-page document where actually all those dilemmas, the plethora of views are being discussed. So it's not just they gather around and write new 10 sentences. It's actually doing a lot of research and going through, analyzing the scenarios and coming through. So I think we have to appreciate that as well, even though we don't know where it leads us. We'll see that in a year's time.
Can I just follow up quickly here?
Yes, well, I look at someone from Polytechnics to give me a sign on time because I left my watch outside of the stage. 5 minutes, so it's going quickly. Please, Stian.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a perfect analogy or comparison, but I do think that something has to happen in the real world and in the financial world, and those have to be somewhat connected. If you think about oil and gas, you know, some people, they want to sell out of oil and gas, divest this. And for a financial portfolio in Norway to do that, while still maintaining society as we have today, with the oil fund, with our own personal private lives, including plastic, you know, even here, even in Norway, the land of electric vehicles. Most automobiles are run on petrol today, right? So I think that and that must have been part of why that campaign did not succeed fully, because people see the contradiction and they feel like maybe this is a bit too much. So I do think actions in the real world matter quite a bit and are really hard to do, and actions in the financial portfolio matter a little bit, but less, in my opinion, but are very easy to do.
Thank you, Stian. Time is running out, but I wanted to ask you for some reflections, Luke, on what do you think on who should ultimately decide what counts as unethical? Is it the finance managers, or is it the politicians? Is it independent experts? How do we prevent politics or other motives to be in the way of setting moral boundaries?
That is a crucial question. But first of all, I want to quickly reflect on some of the things we just discussed. We certainly do live in a changing world. We always have. The key question is, has the underlying reality and the brute facts of nuclear war and nuclear winter changed? No. Have the principles of humanitarian law changed? I would also say no. Has the probability of nuclear war changed? Potentially yes, if anything it's gone up. Has the underlying stance and ethics of Norway and the Norwegian people changed in the last few years? I mean, you would all have a better idea than I, but I suspect not. The key question is, do you want to have your ethics determined by Putin and Trump, or by integrity, principles, and science? I think it's pretty simple in that regard. Going forward, there's an interesting question of what can Norway do, and I agree, we have to think through how can we actually have a material impact in reality. And once again, apartheid could be an interesting case here, where the students in Dartmouth, they weren't really interested in actually trying to inflict financial damage upon the South African government. That was never the point. Instead, it was to essentially take away the social license to operate of what they saw as being an oppressive regime. And in many ways, that worked. And that's, of course, been the key goal behind things like the fossil fuel divestment movement, etc. And when it comes to Norway, I would say actually its greatest power, diplomatically speaking, it's not even what treaties it signs. It is the sovereign wealth fund. And once again, bear in mind, $2 trillion, 1.5% of global equities. And additionally, it is simply a pioneer in terms of how others invest as well. So if Norway really wants to have a genuine impact on an important issue like nuclear weapons, I would actually say that the sovereign wealth fund is probably its most important tool in doing so. And coming back to the question of who should decide, much of my research previously has been in doing what's called foresight, where basically try to think through how do we generate the most plausible pictures of the future. And because of that, I've also done quite a lot of forecasting, which I've mentioned super forecasters before, which essentially is trying to make numerical estimates about future events and then see how accurate they are. And interestingly, when you look across those two fields, and even other areas like collective intelligence, which is essentially how do you make algorithms more intelligent, they often more or less converge upon some really similar principles of you want to have diverse sets of actors with diverse information, and rather than taking just one person's opinion, you take the average across a large amount. And importantly, you want to have them deliberate and exchange information, and you want to have them be relatively objective as well. Interestingly, all this converges with what we call deliberative democracy or open democracy. Things like citizens' assembly and citizens' juries, which actually have a really powerful, good track record of producing results which both generally correspond to the science much more. They tend to also reduce polarization, increase trust in public institutions. For me, I would say, as mentioned earlier, put it down to a citizens' assembly. And granted, I'm not Norwegian, so I have less of a stake in this, but even if I was, I would say I'd be happy to leave that decision in the hands of people who are informed by experts on both sides of the debate and left to make a decision of whether or not the sovereign wealth fund should invest in nuclear weapons. Overall, I think when it comes to the science of expert judgment and the science of collective decision-making, we have very good reasons to believe that citizen assemblies and juries work. And importantly, it's just the most democratic and ethical way of approaching this as well. So for me, I would say leave it to democracy. I'm pretty confident of what the outcome would be.
Thank you, Luke. I think at least for us in NPA, that's a great note to close on. Leave it to democracy, power to the people. We're running out of time, so unfortunately we have to stop here. I want to say a big thank you to our great panel. Thank you to everyone here in this room, everyone listening in on the Polypod, and everyone who's watching the stream live. And yeah, big hand to the panel.